At 60 miles per hour on a highway, a vehicle can lose propulsion without any warning. The engine stops functioning while the car is still moving forward. The steering stiffens. The brake requires more force. The dashboard may go dark. And, in the event of impact, the airbags may not deploy. This was not a test. It was not a simulation. It happened. In vehicles manufactured by General Motors. For years, millions of drivers operated without knowing that a component the size of a coin could interrupt essential systems in motion. The problem was not in the engine, it was not in the electrical system, it was not in software, it was in the ignition switch. A mechanical mechanism inside the steering column that could rotate a few millimeters beyond its intended position. A few millimeters, enough to disable safety systems. Internal documents showed that the risk had already been identified years before the recall. And even so, the vehicles remained in circulation. The case led to federal investigations, congressional hearings in the United States, and estimated costs of more than $4 billion. In total, 124 deaths were officially recognized by the company. This was not merely a mechanical defect, it was an event that remained active for more than a decade. When these vehicles were produced, General Motors was not a company on the rise. It was a century-old institution, founded in 1908, present in dozens of countries, responsible for millions of vehicles per year, one of the largest automakers in the world. Its vehicles were not experimental, they were not prototypes, they were established products sold on a large scale. Among the models involved were the Chevrolet Cobalt and the Saturn Ion. Compact vehicles, popular, accessible, driven daily by students, families, workers. Nothing in their appearance suggested elevated risk. There were no special instructions. There were no unusual warnings. There was no recommendation for extra attention to the ignition. For the driver, starting the vehicle was automatic. Insert the key, turn to run, drive. The system functioned like any other, silent, stable, predictable. And that is precisely what makes this case relevant. The defect was not associated with extreme use. It did not require a prior collision. It did not depend on external modification. It could occur during ordinary driving, on a curve, during an overtaking maneuver, at highway speed. What appeared routine was, in certain cases, a scenario of vulnerability. At that time, the ignition was treated as a standard component, integrated, unquestioned, an invisible part of the vehicle's structure. But internally, technical reports had already raised specific concerns about the torque of the mechanism. What seemed small was beginning to reveal a larger problem. At the center of the case was not a complex electronic system. It was not a software error. It was not a defect in the airbag module. It was a mechanical component. The ignition cylinder. Inside the steering column, the key connects to a mechanism responsible for maintaining the system in its proper operating position. Off. Accessory. Run. Start. For the vehicle to remain powered, the cylinder must provide sufficient resistance to prevent unintended movement. This resistance is measured in torque, and, according to later investigations, the torque of the component installed in certain General Motors models was below specification. This meant that the key could move more easily than it should. Under certain conditions, the weight of a keychain or the impact of a road irregularity could shift the ignition from the run position to accessory. The movement was small, but its consequences were not. When leaving the run position, the engine stopped receiving power. Power steering assistance was compromised. Brake assistance was reduced. And critically, the airbag system could be disabled. The vehicle did not explode. It did not lock instantly. It did not emit a specific warning. It simply lost essential systems while in motion. In 2006, General Motors approved a modification to the component to increase torque. The critical point is that the part number was not changed. Externally, there was no visible difference between older and modified versions. Internally, the problem was already known. The question that remains is, why was the recall only announced years later? The first internal records related to ignition behavior date back to the early 2000s. Technical reports, engineering analyses, discussions about insufficient torque. The problem was not unknown. In 2004, a General Motors engineer formally raised concerns about how easily the key could move out of the run position. In 2005, models such as the Chevrolet Cobalt were already in widespread circulation. Accidents began to be recorded. Some involved sudden loss of electrical power before impact. In certain cases, the airbags did not deploy. Internally, the issue moved across different departments: engineering, cost analysis, impact assessment. There was no immediate public alert. In 2006, the component was modified to increase cylinder resistance, but the part number remained the same. This meant that, in official records, there was no clear distinction between older versions and corrected versions. Externally, nothing changed. The vehicles continued to be sold, to be driven, to be used daily, year after year. In 2009, General Motors entered bankruptcy and underwent restructuring under the supervision of the United States government. Even after the restructuring, the ignition issue had not been formally addressed as a broad recall. Reports continued. The regulatory agency responsible for road safety, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, received notifications over the years, but the full pattern had not yet been consolidated as a public systemic failure. Internally, according to the independent report conducted in 2014, there were failures in communication between teams and in the escalation of risk within the corporate hierarchy. The problem was documented, but it was not prioritized. Meanwhile, the vehicles remained on the road, not for days, not for months, for years. It was only in February 2014 that General Motors announced the initial recall of approximately 2.6 million vehicles, more than a decade after the first technical records. The interval between identification and action became the central focus of investigations, and it is within that interval that this case ceases to be merely technical and becomes institutional. February 2014, General Motors announced the initial recall of approximately 2.6 million vehicles equipped with the defective ignition switch. The announcement marked the transition of the issue from an internal problem to a public event. Models such as the Chevrolet Cobalt, the Saturn Ion, and other compact vehicles were included in the recall. The news gained national attention, not only because of the number of vehicles, but because of the interval between the first technical records and the formal action. Federal investigations were opened. Committees of the United States Congress called for public hearings. The then CEO of General Motors, Mary Barra, had assumed the position only weeks before the recall. In April 2014, she testified before Congress. She acknowledged failures. She stated that the company had not acted quickly enough, and she affirmed that structural changes would be implemented. Meanwhile, an independent compensation program was created to evaluate victims and families. As cases were reviewed, the official number was consolidated. 124 deaths were recognized by the company itself as associated with the ignition defect. More than 275 individuals were officially identified as injured. The case ceased to be a technical failure. It became a symbol of institutional failure. The public questions were no longer about torque. They were about decision. Who knew? When did they know? And why did the recall take so long? From that moment on, the ignition ceased to be a component. It became evidence. After the recall was announced, General Motors retained former federal prosecutor Anton Valukas to conduct an independent investigation. The objective was clear: to understand when the problem was identified, who had knowledge of it, and why the recall took more than a decade. The report was released in May 2014. Its conclusions did not point to a deliberate conspiracy, but they revealed systemic failures in internal communication and in the escalation of risk within the organization. Engineers raised concerns. Meetings took place. Documents were produced. But the issue was not treated as a corporate priority. The report described an organizational culture in which critical decisions could remain fragmented across departments. The defect was not concealed. It was diluted. In 2015, the United States Department of Justice announced a criminal agreement with General Motors. The company agreed to pay $900 million and admitted failures in disclosing information related to the defect. In addition, the total costs associated with the recall, litigation, and compensation were estimated at more than $4 billion. Executives were dismissed. Internal protocols were restructured. New reporting channels were implemented. The case came to be studied in business schools and corporate governance programs as an example of failure in risk management. The component was small. The impact was national. The lesson was structural. The General Motors ignition case was not merely an automotive recall. It was a turning point. It demonstrated that a mechanical component, considered standard, can become a systemic risk when technical decisions are not escalated with the necessary urgency. It was not the complexity of the system that generated the impact. It was the interval. The time between identifying and acting, between documenting and prioritizing, between recognizing and communicating. For more than a decade, The defect remained active in millions of vehicles, not because of technical invisibility, but because of failures in the decision-making structure. After the recall, General Motors announced internal changes, protocol revisions, and new safety reporting mechanisms. The case became part of studies in governance, risk management, and corporate responsibility. It reinforced a fundamental principle. In complex systems, small decisions can generate consequences proportional to the time they remain uncorrected. The ignition ceased to be a component. It became a record. Subscribe to this channel to follow the next documented case.